Our next speaker is Randy Beebe. He's an amateur historian, scuba diver. He does shipwrecks. He's a pilot. Won't go into that anymore. Yeah. And he's interested in Isle Royale. That's the topic of his talk today. Randy Beebe.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'd like to start just by making a couple of disclaimers. The first one is to be on the tail end of a conference has some advantages and disadvantages, and one of the disadvantages is previous speakers may have touched on some points that I'm going to touch on. So some of this might be somewhat repetitive, but the advantage is those earlier speakers, I think, hit these points much more eloquently than I was going to do and in much more detail. My second disclaimer, or excuse if you prefer, is when I started researching for this presentation, the research took me in a whole lot of different directions. It was an incredibly enjoyable subject to research. Unfortunately, my presentation is kind of like that too. It's kind of a willy-nilly, hodgepodge presentation, but I will do my best to try to make it entertaining and to maybe pull it all together in the end. So this is the title of my presentation. It's Who is Mining Copper on Isle Royale in 4016 BC? And there's really nothing special about this date other than it was 6,000 years ago. During the time of what appears to be the peak mining activity on Isle Royale. Also, it's easier for me to visualize a group of individuals instead of, over thousands of years of time span. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we think we know about these people and put things into perspective with what we don't know. And maybe some ideas of methods or some techniques that maybe we can use to learn more about these ancient copper miners. So here's a slide that was already in Bill Ross's presentation and Don Spahn's presentation, and trying to just answer the question, why were they mining copper out there? And the short answer to that, of course, is that's where the copper was. Like Bill Ross pointed out, the geology at Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula is a shared geology, and this is the greatest concentration of native copper anywhere in the world. So that's why they were out there. 6,000 years ago, what type of conditions were these miners facing? First thing, about 6,000 years ago, the lake level was a little bit higher than today. This is during a period called the Nipissing High Phase. And this graph, I think, is a somewhat simplified one and an older graph, but they think the Nipissing is maybe pushing back further to the 6,000, 7,000 year period. And it goes up and down. It's not a gradual increase like that. Over the years, over the last 12,000 years, there's been several different lake levels in what's now the Lake Superior Basin. Starts out with the high Lake Duluth, the Washburn, Beaver Bay, then you go to the Minong and Houghton low stages up to the Nipissing, and then it actually declines to the present day lake level. Here's Don Spahn's nice little chart here, just to give you an idea. If you look at this 6,000 years ago, that's right in the Middle Archaic period, or maybe the late early Archaic. And it was about 1,000 years prior to when the pyramids were built in Egypt, so quite a long time ago. The climate and the plants and animals on Isle Royale were very similar today. Some work in 2003 by Robin Flackney suggests that it was actually a little bit warmer, 1 to 3 degrees warmer Fahrenheit. That was done with sediment core samples in Lily Lake and Lake Ojibwe. And the animals would have been very similar, with the exception of, instead of the predator-prey relationship of wolf and moose, it was most likely caribou and lynx. But the fish would have been very similar, that kind of thing. And this is what they were after. This vein of copper, I've seen this in 2 talks already this weekend. This is on Washington Island, Isle Royale. And this is kind of what they were mostly after, was this stuff, because when it's removed, they could get the size and the chunks of copper that's most useful to them for making the tools and artifacts that they wanted to do. Of course, float copper was also found, and even though they tried to get as much of the copper off of it, they didn't have the technology to use these or cut up these large slabs of copper. So basically, this is what they were doing. And as already mentioned very well with Larry Furrow and David Peterson, the process of refining the copper is through a cold hammering and annealing, repeated heating and cooling process. Copper is found in many places on the island, but the vast majority of the concentration of copper is actually at the end of McCargo Cove, right up here on the northeast side of the island. McCargo Cove is a fracture inlet. It's about 2 miles long. And I've seen some pretty wild estimates of the number of pits on the island in the many, many thousands, but I don't think they've ever been actually counted. But this is where a majority of the prehistoric pits are. Some of them are quite big, 60 feet long and deep, and some of them are only a few feet long. So the whole size varies on those pits. Also, historic mining occurred in the 1800s, early 1900s down here too. The earliest carbon dating just last year, up to last year, put the mining back about 5,200 years ago, but recent work by Dave Pompany pushes that date even further back to 6,500 years. He was doing sediment samples in the bottom of McCargo Cove and looking for trace metals, lead and copper, as an indication of mining activity. And what it appears is there was about a 1,100-year period in here where the mining activity was the greatest, and then it tapered off after that. It probably continued, but it did taper off. Here's a photo of a typical prehistoric pit, kind of a large one. And the technology to remove the copper was very basic. You've got a rock, and you beat on the bedrock long enough to remove the copper from the matrix. If you visit Isle Royale today, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of these hammer stones, these broken and used hammer stones, discarded where they were used and just left there. There's also, I think Don also mentioned, there's also some debate on whether they used fire and shock cooling to help with the process, but they haven't decided if that actually saves any labor, because cutting firewood and hauling water is an awful lot of work too. Once the copper is extracted, once again, Larry and Dave did a good job on this, but the copper is first hammered into usable size chunks and then further refined to these, which are preforms, which will be formed into the final product. These were also used as trade goods, so you can actually trade that up, and then the person who gets it can finish their tool. From Isle Royale, some really good work from Oliver Antilla and others. What they found was what's interpreted as a copper refining, copper reduction workshop on the shore of Canada. This is in the Mink Mountain, Cloud Bay area. So it appears that what the miners were doing is they were making the crossing in here on the shortest distance. It's about 13 miles or so. 14 miles, and from there they were really working the copper down. So either they were coasting along and crossing, maybe in good weather going direct. Very little work has been done up here archaeologically, from what I understand. But I would wager that if you went here to the Sibley Peninsula, you'd also find evidence too, because it's right across from the cove. From there, the copper was traded all along here. This is one estimate that I've seen, kind of a congregate of many estimates. I think it's fairly reasonable. So the copper from Isle Royal, the Keweenaw, and all along the North Shore and other places seemed to find its way in quite a large area. So you could see how these copper artifacts, we're already starting to learn quite a bit about these miners from them, where they were living, their trade networks, their travel patterns, that kind of thing. In addition, some of these artifacts have organic materials, remains in there that could be carbon dated. So this is the South Fowl Point, found in Minnesota, carbon dated to 6,800 years ago. So now the artifacts can also tell us when they were there. So where they were and when they were there, kind of neat. Don did a really good job talking about categories. I'll just go through a couple of them really quick. Projectile points, knives and ulus, from very small, tiny points to very large ones. Knives of all different shapes and sizes. Awls, needles, fish hooks and gaffs. And my favorite is the woodworking tool category. Just a vast array of them. There's celts and gouges, adzes, that kind of thing. So what we take away from all of this, and the stone tools, this is just a generic collection of the stone tools. Now we know a lot about their activities. So we know that they were woodworkers. The other categories, of course, are mining tools and jewelry. Same thing with the stone tools. We can learn something about their hunting techniques, that kind of thing. So these artifacts are speaking from the past. We can infer an awful lot of information when you start to back up and look at the really big picture. Another way that these artifacts can speak from the past is through the practice of experimental archaeology. Dave Peterson and Larry Furrow did a really good job yesterday talking about this, and there's Larry, he's cold hammering the copper. You're actually getting into the mind of these ancient coppersmiths and artists, and kind of learning their thought process when they were doing that. So these all build a good picture of these people. And I think the tendency is start to congratulate ourselves how much we do know about the ancients. Here is just a partial list. And I've only dedicated 10 minutes to this, and of course it would take a college semester or more to do it properly, but this is merely laying the foundation for the rest of my talk. Like Robin said earlier, there's an awful lot of really enjoyable material to read on this. I highly recommend it. A lot of fun. And here's just a very short list. So what's my interest in this? Like Bob mentioned, my background and interest has been in shipwrecks, marine technology, and early watercraft as well. And so when I stand in a place like this is from Mink Mountain on the Canadian shore on a nice winter day, and I look at this thin blue line out on the horizon, not these islands, but out on the horizon, that's Isle Royal. And I wondered, how do people, or how did they get across that stretch of water? And they did it successfully for thousands of years. And I'm certainly not the first one to do so. At least for 160 years, people have been speculating and writing on this very same subject. This stretch of water is a treacherous stretch of water. I think anybody that's made that crossing or has boated on Lake Superior can attest to that. This is a 28-foot boat. This is running the inlet at McCargo Cove on not really a bad day. This is Lake Superior. There was no thunderstorms or anything. The wind was just blowing up out of the northeast at about 20 miles an hour. So I don't know if I'd want to be doing that in a open boat. Dynamic weather patterns, lots of dense fog, the short, steep waves. Of course, the water's cold, especially in the springtime. Hypothermia is a real danger. And then not a lot of harbors in some cases. So this is the challenges that the ancients were facing to get to the island and back. So with all this in mind, I was very happy or lucky to have been able to put together a volunteer effort to do a full underwater archaeological survey of McCargo Cove. This was a collaborative effort with the National Park Service, and it was supervised by Seth DePascal he's a cultural resource manager out at the island, the Great Lakes and the Great Lakes Shipwreck Preservation Society. We had a really good group of divers and historians, and it was a 2-year project. We did it in 2012 and 2013. It was a 2-phase project. The first one was to do a Sidescan survey of McCargo Cove using remote sensing. For those of you that are not familiar with a Sidescan, it uses sound waves to give a depiction of what's below the boat. Here's just a good example that shows the different bottom types, and I think Scott Hamilton pointed out some of the Sidescan data as well. So here's some bedrock, here's some silt. This would be the left side of the boat and the right side of the boat. And here's a man-made structure, this little square cribbing. So we completed the whole cove from the mouth all the way to the end. We didn't find anything really of interest other than a rock that really looked like a boat. But when we dove it, that's what we found was a boat-shaped rock. We did find some cribbing and some dock structures that were associated with the historical mining period, but that was about it. We also did a diver survey, a visual survey of McCargo Cove. We weren't the first people to dive there. In the 1960s, the Oshkosh Public Museum used volunteer divers, and they dove near the mouth of the cove. And in the 1970s, Ken Barana from the National Park Service did some really good documentation work at the mouth of the cove and at the base of the cove where the mining activity was the highest. But we were the first group to do a full survey of the cove. And what did we find? A lot of historic stuff, lots of neat old bottles, personal items such as this pipe some poor fishermen lost. We found about a dozen of these. These are iron, and what we think these are boiler grates. So some steamship had done a field repair in the cove, maybe had some warped boiler grates, so they just tossed the old ones into the lake, out of sight, out of mind. More personal items, clay pipe bowls, maybe from the historic mining period, and then once again these wooden structures, probably from the mining. Nothing prehistoric either. We did find a couple of these. We interpreted these as net sinkers or net anchors. So you just tie a cord on there and you use it as an anchor. Problem with these is there's no way of telling if these are 500 years old or 50 years old. But all the objects we found was returned to where we found it. It was just recorded and returned. And this is what happens to you when you look at rocks for a week underwater. Kind of a sensory deprivation tank. My dive partner, Pete. But the reason why I included this photo I didn't have a lot of photos as I got further down into the base of the cove, but if you notice how green the water is, the visibility started dropping drastically closer in, further away from the lake. And at 30 feet, it was so bad, it was pitch black, and Pete and I got separated on 2 different occasions, even though we were swimming right next to each other with powerful flashlights. So that I estimate there was about 50% that we were unable to survey. We were able to swim all along the shore, and the visibility was good to about 25 feet. But the center of the cove really remains uninvestigated. So that was kind of the results of that survey. We certainly learned a lot. Another project I was happy to be involved in was the what's called the Relic Shoreline Survey of Isle Royale. This was in 2012 also. And the idea behind this, when I mentioned those earlier lake levels, like the Nipissing and the Minong phase, well, they left ancient shorelines, which is really kind of a neat deal. And these little hatch marks indicate the Nipissing and the Minong shorelines. The ones closer to the lake are about 5,000 years old from the Nipissing, so that applies directly to our copper miners. And then the one further in is called the Minong phase. And so what archaeologists are doing, and they're using this successfully, is you can look at these ancient shorelines and make an educated guess. Then you could postulate that, hey, perhaps this point would be a good place to camp. And then they go out there and they do a survey looking for artifacts, and lo and behold, they're being quite successful at it. The data that they actually use to do this is it's called Leiter. And Scott Hamilton touched on this briefly. Stands for Light Imaging, Detection, and Ranging. It's an aircraft-mounted laser beam that gives you an amazingly accurate depiction of the topography below the aircraft. And I didn't have any LiDAR data from Isle Royale, but that's okay. I live in Minnesota, and that whole state has been flown, and it's public information. So as an example, I just pulled this up. This is called Moose Mountain. This is near my home. This is the Lester River. This little corner here is Lake Superior. And this is called Moose Mountain. If you look real carefully, you can see these parallel lines going all the way around. That's an ancient shoreline from Lake Duluth, about 11,000 years old. So an archaeologist could say, hey, maybe this point would be a good place to look. The way to do the survey is really just kind of, I guess, hand-to-hand combat from an archaeologist standpoint. Every 30 meters, you just stop. You're running a transect, you stop, dig a hole, and then all the material is sifted through screens, and you're looking for debitage, you're looking for copper, you're looking for stone. And this is kind of a neat photo. Really, this is Sam and Lou and Seth. And you see this flat bench here, and it's hard to tell, but this drops off about 25 feet or so. And so 5,000, 6,000 years ago, this was the lake. And it was washing up along here. Even though we're a long way from Lake Superior here, this was the old shoreline. And the material we're digging up is sand and rounded cobble. And sure enough, during this effort, we found 2 habitation sites. So tools that were from this period that we're interested in. Really neat project.
So you were going along the length of this bench, this ancient
Yes.
shoreline.
Yeah, exactly. We were walking an old beach and just putting in test pits.
Cool.
Yeah, it was really kind of a privilege to be involved in that. I mentioned before that, we start to get, I think, a little bit of hubris on what we do know about these people. And now I want to put things in context about what we don't know. This is a very tough area for archaeologists to operate. It's a very wet, acidic environment, and organic remains do not survive very well. And we also don't have a lot of the properties that tend to preserve them. When you think about like Pompeii, we have volcanoes, landslides, caves, receding glaciers. That's another real productive area for organic material that we can learn from. And to put this in context, we're just going to go temporarily all the way to the other side of the planet, to New Guinea. And the story of, I think, one of the most fascinating first contact experiences in history. And a first contact is where a civilization is unknown to the outside world is discovered and then contacted. And in 1938, in the interior of New Guinea, which was long thought to be uninhabited, a man named Richard Archibald flew his airplane over an area called the Grand Valley. And to his astonishment, he found there was roughly 50,000 people living in this valley. And nobody knew about them. And even though the Dutch had been living on their shores for 200 years or more, these people knew nothing of the outside world. It turned out to be a real windfall for archaeologists, anthropologists, linguists, people who were able to study a Stone Age society, a functioning Stone Age society in every definition of the term. So they were able to study their belief systems, their traditions, their knowledge of their environment and how they lived, their music, their boats. They had two-story dwellings. It was really kind of a fascinating story. But as a thought experiment, let's assume that those people hadn't survived. And the archaeologists went to these places and did the best they could. This is what they would find. They would just find stone tools of varying properties and debitage from the making of stone tools. And they could make inferences. They said, well, you know, we know they were working wood and they were maybe doing some agriculture. But all that other information, all of it, really their whole culture would have been lost. And I think that illustrates really well the challenges that the archaeologists have to face up here. There's another phenomenon that I think Al touched on earlier, and that's he put it really well, the shared technology. And so I have this slide. You'll probably never see these two in the same slide again. As an illustration, this here is a classic Clovis point, named after Clovis, New Mexico, where the first one was found in the 1930s. Fluted point, roughly 10,000 years old. And since that first point was found, they've been found everywhere from the Arctic all the way down to Venezuela. They're so diagnostic and they're so numerous that they're actually used as a diagnostic point for what's called the Clovis culture. But it doesn't take much imagination to think that the people that were living in New Mexico were vastly different than the people that were living up here or down in Venezuela. You know, maybe they were, in general terms, you could call them hunter-gatherers, and their lifestyle had similarities, but all the other cultural things were very, very different. So the technology that works tends to cross borders and is continued to use, and it leads us to a misapprehension that there's a homogeneity of culture that I think doesn't exist. Just to use New Guinea as an example, in New Guinea alone there was 1,000 different languages. Not dialects, but 1,000 different languages. So it's very possible or likely that the miners in Isle Royale and the miners that were living here in the Keweenaw possibly didn't even speak the same language. You know, they had the same lifestyle, but their culture could have been radically different. So distance and time changes cultures, especially distance back then where traveling was much slower and harder to do. As a modern example, I bring this up, the AK-47. There's about 350 million of these on the planet. They're made in dozens of different countries. And if a future archaeologist were to do a dig on the planet and find all these things, they might draw the conclusion that we were a real homogeneous society in the world. And they might even call us the AK-47 culture. But this artifact tells nothing about the conflicts and the geopolitical boundaries that it transects. So that's just an illustration. The last part of my presentation then, since we've kind of identified that, is maybe some methods that we can do to learn a little bit more. So we're working with like half of the puzzle, the non-organic stuff, the copper and the stone tools. That's about half of the puzzle. So how can we get more of it up here? Once again, going back to my primary interest, which is watercraft. We'll talk about that a little bit. To get from Canada to Isle Royale, they had a few options. The first one is this, dugout canoe. I think it's a very insufficient answer to the problem, but that's a possibility. There would be a bark boat. This is an example of the classic Ojibwe canoe, really a masterpiece of technology. We still use it today. The materials may be a little bit different, but the design is very little changed. So were they using one of these? Was it a more primitive version or maybe a more advanced one? A larger boat? We just don't know. Here's another option, the hide-covered boat. I took this picture in Wainwright, Alaska, of an umiak. Hide-covered boat would have a wood frame, and then they cover it with animal hide. And this umiak is still used today in whale hunting up in the Arctic Ocean, a remarkably seaworthy boat. You can put 8 paddlers in it and a ton of gear, and you can take it out in the open sea. This is walrus hide here. If you don't have walrus hide, that's okay. This boat here, this is the Yukon River in the 1930s. That's covered with moose hide. So there's a possibility. The one common thing on all these boats, which is pretty obvious, is it's all organic. It's all wood and leather and fiber, and that stuff just doesn't exist, or doesn't last, I should say. Materials are preserved, and conditions, an anaerobic environment, wet environments, tend to preserve organic stuff for a long, long time. Getting back to this dugout canoe, this one is in the Historical Society Museum in Superior, Wisconsin. It's about 300 years old. This was found in the Brule River, buried in the sediment. This, right in the Keweenaw here, this is a field drawing by Jim Pocketat. This shows a bead maker's kit. There's copper nuggets. There was some fabric in there, a crescent knife, and some copper awls and a bunch of beads. And the leather bag was still preserved, and so was the fabric. So the copper also acts as a preservative in the wet environments. In my home state of Minnesota, this was done during a highway project. They found a campsite that was dated 8,000 years ago with animal bones and wood tools and a lot of things that just wouldn't survive. And it was a wet environment. Our recently retired state archaeologist in Minnesota, Scott Anfinson, he put it really well, so I'm going to quote him directly. He said, "Wet environments are very difficult to find and very difficult to dig, but they're very rewarding because what you can get out of them." So, seems to me that to search for these wet environments would be a productive way to spend some time. Some of the methods, of course, I'll just touch on briefly. Underwater archaeology. So here's McCargo Cove again, and we talked about surveying the cove. Another technique which was used successfully in the Mediterranean by Bob Ballard, he surmised that the ancient mariners probably would coast along a shoreline like this for protection from the wind. And on a day where the wind was out of the south, you'd be quite a bit protected. But these mariners would end up coming to a bay mouth, and they were faced with a decision. And that decision would be, should we wait on this island till the weather gets better, or should we try it? And you know how guys are.
Go for it.
Yeah, let's go for it. And so what he did was he said, we're going to look at these bay mouths. And sure enough, he found ancient shipwrecks in the Mediterranean using this technique. And I think that's something that we could use not only in Lake Superior, but on inland lakes productively. The whole north shore of Lake Superior with the fur trade traffic and everything, I think that's kind of a neat and untapped potential resource. Some of the technology you could use, just to touch on the side scan again, my favorite technology. It's fairly inexpensive, very productive. You could cover lots of ground. And it's been very successful looking for ancient shipwrecks. This is called the Onegin boat in Ireland. Beautiful side scan image of it. And they dove it, documented it, sampled the wood. And it's over 4,500 years old. So, and Europe has got numerous examples of these ancient boats, and some even go back further than 4,500 years. Even in the United States, there's been dugout canoes that are found in Florida that are almost 5,000 years old. So these ancient boats are there, hard to find. So we did side scan McCargo Cove, and we didn't see anything on the surface. The sediment in McCargo Cove is a very silty and doesn't have much body to it. You can actually reach out and bury your whole arm into the bottom of the sediment. So I think I'm on safe or solid ground when I assert that there is evidence of, there's been thousands of years of mining in McCargo Cove, and there is evidence on the bottom of that cove. It's not on the surface of the sediment, but it's probably buried in the sediment. Here's another piece of technology I've used in the past in previous surveys. This is called a sub-bottom profiler. It's a little bit lower frequency sound than a side scan, and what that does is it gives it the ability to look into the sediment under ideal conditions as deep as like 60 feet. So it's an amazing tool. Unfortunately, the property of the low frequency that gives it the ability to penetrate, it doesn't give much resolution because of that, because the wavelengths are longer on the sound. However, this is changing rapidly, this technology. The engineers are aware of this problem, and that the marine archaeologists would really like to reconcile this penetration resolution problem, and maybe in 10 years or so, maybe the unopened time capsule of the sediment in McCargo Cove will be opened. That would be really, really neat. And it's non-destructive, which is, I think marine archaeology is moving towards that more and more. Some exciting things locally, and that is pockets of organic material, and this is sticking with the theme of underwater archaeology. These are sunken forests. This one here was found by my friend Pete Lindquist in the 1980s, and he thought he found a shipwreck. And on a side scan sonar, he saw things standing up, and he thought they were schooner masts. So they suited up, and they dove to 180 feet, and to his astonishment, there was a forest down there, and the trees were still standing. They had the wood sampled, 8,900 years old. So all this organic material was preserved. Many more examples of it, mostly in Lake Huron. This is the called the Sunken Forest, or the Project Drowned Forest. Doug Hunter, this is the Noble Foundation. They found, I think, 5 of these sites, and these were associated with the Nipissing period of the lake level rise, which we're interested in, much shallower water, about 40, 50 feet, and all kinds of trees, leaf litter, that kind of thing on the bottom. What's really neat about this one is in the one of these sites are in the Straits of Mackinac, and there's a drowned river right by the site and an underwater cave. And from an archaeologist standpoint, that's a really exciting thing, because you're looking for those desirable campsites from 5,000 years ago, and that just fits the bill really nicely. I don't think it's been surveyed yet in detail. This is just a few years ago. Problem with underwater archaeology, it's expensive, lots of logistics, it's hard to be productive. So we're going to move now to wetland archaeology, and this is what our area here in the UP, Minnesota, and Isle Royal has a wealth of. And this is these wet environments, such as dry lake bottoms, riverbanks, oxbows, bogs, and bog lakes, that these environments will also serve to preserve wood and leather for long amounts of time. If you Google search bog finds, especially in Europe, bodies, whole battlefields of casualties found in bogs. You can see the tattoos on the skin. The skin's all there, the hair, and it's so perfectly preserved from thousands of years ago, because it's a very, very amenable environment for that. Europe seems to be further ahead in this technique than we are. We just kind of haven't been thinking along those lines very much. So there are sites on land that exist that have organic materials, and they're quite numerous, actually. I know Minnesota's got hundreds of them, and they're usually small pockets that were buried, but there's also buried forests. This is probably the most well-known one in this area. This is called the Gribben Forest. This is down by Marquette County, and they were mining sand from a sand pit down here, and they found a stand of 140 trees that was carbon dated to about 10,000 years ago. Pretty neat. There's actually one of these, I think, on display in the museum over, the mining museum over in Marquette. The disadvantage with a lot of these sites is they're mostly associated with glacial activity. So violent outwashes and ice dams, that puts their dates quite a bit older than we're interested in some cases. And also it's hard to predict where they are. It's hard to predict that this would or would not be a good archaeological site to look. But this one here, and now I'm finally getting to the point of my talk, this one here is completely different. This is called the Elm River site right here in Houghton County on the west side of the peninsula near Misery Bay. This site was found by Steve Shetron, and it's interpreted to be formed by a rapid lake level rise. And that is during the lake level rise from the low stage, Houghton low stage, up to the Nipissing period. And it's about a half-mile long. Everything is so perfectly preserved. There's leaves, there's pine needles, pine cones, there's bark on the trees, and it's all about 6,000 years old. So that's right in the area that we're interested in. And even more interesting is, if that is true, that the lake, if we can understand this, and it is true that the lake level rise caused this, there should be many more around the lake, like a bathtub ring. And also there should be a way to predict where they are, looking for the right soil type, the right topography maybe. And also it's possible then to say Well, since this is associated with the old ancient relic shoreline and there's organic matter, this would be a good place or would not be a good place to camp. Occupation for the last year or so is to try to find these sites and try to understand them. It's kind of like tilting at windmills a little bit, but it's kind of a fun endeavor.
How far up the river is that?
It's right on the shore of Lake Superior, actually.
I know, but it splits. It goes to the right and goes to the left.
I think it's north of the river on the Lake Superior shoreline.
Right, you're talking the Elm River right next to Agate Beach.
Yes. Yeah.
But the
Yeah.
river does a split, that's the question. You're saying right after the shore at the mouth of the river?
Yeah, it's actually about a half-mile long, and I can't get there right now. I'm finding that these sites are hard to get to, and then it's remarkably hard to find a forest in a forest, if that makes any sense. And so when I go out there, there's been erosion and sloughing, so these trees have been falling, and I'm looking for trees, so I'm actually having trouble finding this one again. But if I could find it, what I'd like to do is take the elevation, the soil type, and especially its relation to the old Nipissing shorelines, so then you could have a baseline around the lake. So that's a possibility. Maybe we could find some of those organic remnants, maybe watercraft, some of their lodging, some of their clothing, maybe carved artwork. We don't know. That's the stuff that we don't know. It would be 1 in a million to find it, but it doesn't hurt to think about. Here's another potential source for these sites I think is worth looking at. And this is through the process of barrier beaches. Barrier beach is where over a bay, with the current going along, the current slows down a little bit when it crosses a bay and it starts to drop its sediment down. When it does that, a sandbar forms. It's called a barrier beach. And over time, it'll actually close that off. This is the area on Isle Royal, the southwest corner. The southwest corner of Isle Royal. This is the Minong phase, so this is about 10,000 years ago. You can see the lake levels radically different. This is the current Isle Royal shoreline. But this was a bay, Feldman Lake, and then over time the beach formed, and then when the water drops, now you have a lake. You can see that same process happening here. This is Halloran Bay. And then the barrier beaches would form here, and then this turned into a lake as well. So what's neat about that, this is a really nice, this is from Indiana University. It's kind of a nice diagram. The barrier beach forms and then kind of closes off the bay, and then you've got a wetland and a marsh in there. And what a neat place to look for habitation sites. And we all know that bay shorelines are a wonderful place to set up a camp because you've got good fishing, you've got access to the lake for transportation. So I think that's really worth taking a look at, exploring anyways. Here's this map again I showed you. This is Feldman Lake. This is today. You can see these, the depiction of the ancient shorelines. This is Lake Halloran here once again, and the ancient shorelines here across. If you look at the satellite photo, you can see this wetland. This is the old bay all along in here. So wet, nice environment for my early shipwrecks, and a nice place to camp 6,000 years ago. So it's worth taking a look at. And even on the satellite photo, you can see these shorelines. So this was 6,000, 7,000 years ago right there.
Now, on that map now that you just had up, when you showed where the shore used to be, so does that decrease the distance between where the shore used to be and Isle Royal? Right there, you showed us those little,
This one here?
right, that's where the shore used to be?
Yeah.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so then where's Isle Royal? Does that shorten the distance between that shore and Isle Royal?
This is Isle Royal. Am I not understanding your question?
Oh, okay, so where's Canada?
Oh, sure, yeah. So Canada is up here, kind of going across, and we're down here. So yeah, this is the southwest corner of the island.
So it doesn't change the distance to the shore?
You know, it did a little bit. You know, well, the lake level did. So, but I don't think a whole lot, because these shorelines are only, I think even the old ones are a matter of maybe 300 feet inland. So, you know, and then in Canada that would be, so you'd save 600 feet, you know, so not a whole lot. But what it does do, I was talking with Scott Hamilton about this, is there are some features in between Canada and Isle Royale that would be more exposed, so that would allow these early boaters to have more harbors of refuge as they hopscotch up and down the lake. And to go back to the LiDAR data again, oh, and these lakes, by the way, when you fly over the Great Lakes, you start seeing a lot of these old lakes that were paleo bays but are now lakes, so that's kind of neat. And then also, if you start looking at the LiDAR data, you start seeing these features in a lot of places. Here, Isle Royale is now down here. This is the Pigeon River State Park in Minnesota, right on the Canadian-US border. So right across from Isle Royale. And what you see is these old shorelines. This is the Lake Superior here. This is the old shorelines, and these other old shorelines when it used to be a bay. So even though it's not a lake in here, this would probably be that nice environment for looking for organic material, a great place to camp and to process copper. So that's kind of exciting. And with that, I will conclude my talk. And I know I've touched on a lot of subjects that I really know little or nothing about. So if I said something in error or something incompletely, please point that out to me. I'd like to learn from this as well. And I can probably take a few questions now too. Yeah?
You have the bag with the beads and copper. Has there ever, besides the drawing, has there ever been a photograph of it?
I don't know that. And I think Sue Martin would know. Yeah, and it's been on my to-do list is to ask her about it. So, anything else?
Sue Martin did report on that in her book that she's written, so Sue Martin is the person to talk to when it goes in.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's a pretty neat find, I think. And yeah, the more organic material, the better. So, no more questions? All right, well, thank you, everybody.